They thought the land had been forgotten, just another broken stretch of earth in rural Montana, left behind by time and silence. So they stayed. Two sisters with nowhere else to go, a child who needed a home, and an old woman who had already lost hers. They rebuilt it, slowly, board by board, fence by fence. Years passed. Quiet, fragile, almost like it might last. Then one morning, the sound came. A truck rolling down the gravel road, slow, deliberate. At first they thought it was him again, the man who kept circling back, watching, waiting for the moment they would give up. But this time, it wasn't. The man who stepped out didn't look like a stranger to the land, just a stranger to them, a former Navy SEAL. Beside him, a German shepherd. And when he said, "This is my land. What are you doing here?" everything changed, because the place they had fought so hard to save had never truly been theirs. If this story moves you, let me know where you're watching from. Share your thoughts, hit like, and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's keep spreading stories like this. Early spring settled quietly over rural Montana, the kind of cold that lingered beneath the skin even as the snow began to retreat. The mountains stood distant and pale beneath a washed-out sky, their peaks still holding winter while the valley below struggled toward something softer. A thin mist hovered low across the open fields, drifting slowly over patches of thawing earth and old fence lines that cut through the land like fading memories. The gravel road stretched forward, narrow and uneven, carrying no sound but the steady roll of tires and the faint whisper of wind brushing against dry grass. Rowan Vance drove without music, without distraction, one hand resting firmly on the steering wheel as if the motion itself required discipline. He was a man built from stillness, tall at around 6'2", broad-shouldered but not imposing in a way that demanded attention. His strength sat quietly in the way he held himself, in the way he didn't waste movement. His dark brown hair was cut short, practical, untouched by style, and his gray eyes carried a depth that suggested they had seen too much and chosen to say very little about it. He wore a red and black plaid flannel shirt over a faded charcoal t-shirt, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, paired with old denim jeans and scuffed leather boots that had traveled more miles than he cared to count. There was a faint stiffness in his posture, not from injury alone, but from habit, years of training that never quite left the body, even when the war was long behind him. 10 years had passed since he had last driven this road. 10 years since he had chosen distance over memory, silence over confrontation. The land ahead had once belonged to his family, a place built not from wealth but from persistence. After his parents died in a winter accident during his deployment, the property had been left to him. Letters had come, notices had followed, taxes went unpaid. Rowan had ignored them all, not out of carelessness, but because returning meant facing something he had buried too deep to name. So instead he had kept moving, from state to state, job to job, never staying long enough for anything to take hold. Beside him, a German shepherd sat upright in the passenger seat, steady and silent. The dog's name was Coda, a 7-year-old working breed with a thick black and tan coat and a posture that mirrored Rowan's own. Alert, controlled, never restless without reason. His ears stood forward, catching every subtle shift in sound, while his amber eyes tracked the road ahead with quiet intelligence. Coda had come into Rowan's life after the military, not as a replacement for anything lost, but as something new that didn't demand explanation. He didn't bark without cause, didn't seek attention unnecessarily. He simply stayed, observed, and acted when it mattered. In many ways, he understood Rowan better than most people ever had. The truck slowed as the gravel road narrowed further, the trees thinning just enough to reveal the property ahead. Rowan's grip tightened slightly on the wheel, not out of fear, but anticipation layered with something more complicated. He had prepared himself for ruin, for collapse, for a structure swallowed by time and neglect. That would have been easier, that would have made sense. But what he saw instead forced something unfamiliar into his chest. The fence still stood, not perfectly, sections had been patched with mismatched wood, some posts reinforced at odd angles, but it was standing. The front gate, though worn, had been rehung properly. The field beyond showed signs of care. Soil had been turned recently, rows uneven but deliberate, as if someone had worked them by hand rather than machine. And then there was the house. The farmhouse rose at the center of the land, weathered but intact. The roof had been repaired in places, different shades of wood marking the effort. The windows were no longer broken or boarded, they were clean enough to reflect the pale light of morning, and from the chimney, a thin line of smoke curled upward into the cold air. Rowan didn't move for a moment. He simply sat there, engine idling, eyes fixed on something that shouldn't have been possible. Someone was living here. Coda shifted slightly, his head tilting just enough to acknowledge the change. He didn't growl, didn't tense, but his focus sharpened, his body leaning forward in quiet readiness. He had already registered what Rowan was still processing. Rowan turned off the engine. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pressing in from all sides. He stepped out of the truck, boots crunching softly against gravel, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the land. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and damp soil, not abandonment, but life. He closed the door without slamming it, his movements measured, controlled. Every instinct he had learned, every habit forged through years of service, settled into place without effort. Not aggressive, not defensive, just aware. Coda stepped down beside him, landing with quiet precision. He stayed close, not touching, but within reach, his gaze moving across the property with careful attention. He noted the fence, the ground, the house, the open space between them. Nothing escaped him. Rowan walked toward the gate first, his eyes scanning the repairs. The wood was rough cut, likely salvaged or traded. The nails weren't uniform, but they held. Whoever had done this didn't have much, but they knew enough to make it work. That told him something. Not professionals, not investors. People who stayed because they had to. He pushed the gate open slowly. It didn't creak. That, more than anything, unsettled him. The path leading to the house had been cleared, not perfectly, but intentionally. A shovel leaned against a tree nearby, its metal edge worn from repeated use. A small stack of firewood sat neatly beside the porch, cut unevenly but arranged with care. This wasn't temporary. This was lived in. Rowan approached the porch, each step steady, his eyes taking in every detail. The front door showed signs of repair, the frame reinforced where it had once split. The handle had been replaced. Even the hinges looked newer than the rest of the structure. He stopped just short of the steps. For the first time since arriving, something shifted in his expression. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to disbelief, edged with something quieter, something he didn't want to name. He had stayed away for 10 years, and in that time, someone else had come in and brought this place back to life. Coda moved slightly ahead, then paused, looking back at Rowan for the briefest second, as if waiting for direction. Rowan gave none. He simply stepped forward. The wood of the porch creaked under his weight, and just as his hand lifted toward the door, he noticed something else. Footprints. Not old, not faded. Fresh. Rowan's gaze lowered, studying them carefully. Smaller than his own. More than one set. One heavier, one lighter. Patterns of movement, not just passing through, but returning. Repeating. A routine. Someone lived here. He straightened slowly, his eyes lifting back to the door. The quiet around him no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. For a moment, he said nothing. Did nothing. Because this wasn't what he had prepared for. This wasn't a return to something lost. This was something else entirely. Something already in motion. And as Rowan Vance stood there, on the threshold of a place he had once called home, he realized that whatever waited on the other side of that door, it wasn't the past. It was something new. Waiting. The door opened before Rowan could knock. It wasn't sudden, but it was immediate enough to tell him they had already known he was there. The woman standing in the doorway held herself forward, blocking the entrance with a quiet kind of resolve that didn't come from confidence, but from necessity. She was in her early 30s, around 32, with sun-worn skin and blonde hair tied loosely at the back, strands falling free around a face that had seen more strain than rest. Her build was lean, not fragile, but shaped by work rather than comfort, and her eyes held a steady sharpness that didn't flinch easily. This was Harper Cole. Even without knowing her name yet, Rowan could see the role she had taken on long before this moment. She was the one who stood in front. Behind her, slightly offset but close enough to step forward if needed, stood another woman. Younger, maybe 29, with darker hair pulled into a low braid, her posture tighter, her shoulders drawn in just enough to suggest caution rather than fear. Her face was softer in structure, but her eyes moved constantly, taking in Rowan, the truck behind him, the dog at his side. Sienna Cole. Where Harper met things head-on, Sienna measured them first. She didn't speak immediately, but her presence filled the space just as much. For a moment, no one said anything. Coda remained beside Rowan, still as stone, his gaze level and unreadable. He didn't step forward, didn't shift his weight, just watched. Harper spoke first. Her voice was firm, though there was a faint edge beneath it, something sharpened by experience. "You need to turn around." Rowan didn't react right away. His eyes moved once between the two women, then back to the doorway behind them, noting what little he could see of the interior. Clean, lived in, not temporary. "I don't think so," he said, his voice low, controlled, not raised but carrying weight. Sienna's eyes flicked to Coda, then back to Rowan. "We're not looking for trouble," she said quietly, though her stance didn't soften. "So whatever you're here for, you can just leave it." That was when it settled. To them, he wasn't an owner returning home. He was another man coming to take something. Rowan let out a slow breath, the kind that came from choosing not to escalate. He reached into his jacket. Both women stiffened instantly, Harper's foot shifting forward, her hand tightening slightly at her side, ready to react without hesitation. Sienna leaned in just enough, her body angled, preparing to move if needed. Coda didn't move. Rowan pulled out a folded set of documents and held them up without stepping closer. "This land," he said, "belongs to me." The words didn't land cleanly. They hit like something neither of them had prepared for. Harper blinked once, the tension in her face cracking just enough to let something else through. Not fear, not yet. Something closer to disbelief. "That's not possible," she said, though her voice had already lost some of its certainty. "We've been here for years," Sienna added, quieter now, her eyes searching Rowan's face for something she couldn't name. "No one came. No one claimed it." Rowan lowered the papers slightly, but didn't put them away. "That doesn't change what it is." Silence followed. Not empty this time, but heavy with something shifting. Harper took a small step back, not retreating, just recalculating. "We thought it was abandoned," she said, the words coming slower now, less defensive, more honest. "When we found it, the place was falling apart. Roof was gone in sections, windows broken, nothing worked." Sienna spoke again, her voice steady but quieter. "We didn't take anything. There was nothing to take. We just fixed what we could, stayed." Rowan didn't interrupt. He listened. Because what they were saying matched what he had already seen. Harper continued, her shoulders lowering just slightly. "We didn't have anywhere else. It wasn't about stealing. It was about surviving." Coda shifted then, just a step forward, not toward them, but into the space between both sides. His movement was slow, deliberate, drawing attention without threat. His presence changed the air more than any words could. Sienna noticed first. Her eyes dropped to him, her expression tightening for a brief second before something else replaced it. Curiosity, uncertainty. She didn't step back. "He's not going to do anything," Rowan said. It wasn't reassurance, it was fact. Harper studied the dog for a moment longer, then looked back at Rowan. "We've had people come before," she said. "Not like you. They didn't knock." That explained more than anything else. The way they stood, the way they reacted, the way they expected the worst before anything else. Rowan nodded once, slow. "I'm not here for that." Sienna let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Not relief, just a slight shift. From inside the house, a faint sound broke the moment. Movement. Light, uneven steps across wood. Harper's head turned immediately, her attention snapping toward the sound before returning to Rowan just as quickly. "Stay there," she said, not harsh but firm, before stepping slightly aside. The movement revealed more of the interior behind her. A table, a stove, signs of routine, Rowan didn't move forward. He didn't need to. A small figure appeared behind Harper, stopping just short of the doorway. A boy, no older than 8, with messy brown hair and a face that hadn't quite decided whether it belonged to a child or someone forced to grow up too early. His clothes were worn but clean, sleeves rolled unevenly, and in his hands he held something carved from wood. A rifle shape, rough, clearly handmade, but held with absolute seriousness. This was Miles Cole. He stepped forward with uneven confidence, planting his feet the way he thought he should. "You need to leave," he said, his voice louder than it needed to be, like he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Rowan raised both hands slowly, not mocking, not dismissive. "All right," he said evenly. "I hear you." Coda lowered himself to the ground near Rowan's side, calm, unbothered, his presence steady. Miles glanced at the dog, then back at Rowan, clearly unsure which one to focus on. The uncertainty showed, but he didn't step back. Sienna's expression softened just slightly, something protective surfacing as she watched him. Harper moved her hand gently to the boy's shoulder. "It's okay," she said, her voice quieter now. The tension shifted again, not gone, but changed. Rowan lowered his hand slowly. "I'm not here to force anyone out today," he said. "But this place, it's not abandoned." Harper nodded once, the weight of that settling in. Sienna looked toward the ground briefly, then back up. No one argued, because they knew. They had just hoped it wasn't true. The wind moved lightly across the field behind Rowan, carrying the scent of earth and smoke. The house stood between them, no longer just a structure, but something contested in a way none of them had expected. Rowan looked at each of them in turn, not as intruders, not as enemies, as people who had stayed when he hadn't. And for the first time since he arrived, the situation wasn't simple anymore. It wasn't about ownership. It was about what came next. The silence that followed didn't break all at once. It stretched, thin and uncertain, like something waiting to see which direction it would be pulled. Rowan stood just outside the doorway, neither stepping forward nor turning away, while Harper and Sienna remained where they were, holding their ground without quite knowing what came next. The air carried a quiet weight now, not sharp like before, but unsettled in a different way, as if the truth had shifted everything but solved nothing. Miles didn't move. He stood there with the wooden rifle still in his hands, his small fingers wrapped tightly around something he clearly believed mattered. Up close, Rowan could see more detail in him. The boy was about 8, maybe younger, with a narrow frame that hadn't filled out yet, and a face marked by freckles across his nose and cheeks. His brown hair fell unevenly, like it had been cut without a mirror, and his clothes, an oversized jacket and worn boots, suggested more practicality than comfort. But it was his eyes that held Rowan's attention. They weren't afraid, not completely. They were watchful, measuring, trying to understand what kind of man stood in front of his home. Because to him, this place was exactly that. Home. Rowan lowered his hands fully now, letting them rest at his sides. "You always stand guard like that?" he asked, his tone even, not mocking, not dismissive. Miles hesitated, then lifted his chin just a fraction. "Only when I have to," he said. Sienna exhaled softly, a sound that carried both tension and something close to a smile, though it didn't fully reach her face. Harper's hand remained on the boy's shoulder, steady, grounding him. Rowan nodded once. "That's fair." Coda shifted again, rising from the ground and taking a slow step forward. His movement drew Miles's attention immediately. The boy's grip tightened for a moment, the wooden rifle lifting slightly before stopping halfway, uncertainty cutting through his resolve. Coda didn't react to the gesture. He simply stood there, head level, tail still, his posture calm but aware. "He won't hurt you," Rowan said. Miles didn't answer right away. His eyes moved between Rowan and the dog, searching for something that couldn't be explained in words. Then, slowly, almost without realizing it, he lowered the rifle. Coda took another step. Not closer than necessary, just enough to close the distance between tension and curiosity. Miles crouched slightly, the motion hesitant but deliberate. He reached out, stopping short at first, his hand hovering in the space between them. Coda didn't lean in immediately. He waited. Then, after a brief pause, he shifted forward just enough to meet the boy's hand halfway. That was all it took. The tension in the doorway eased, not completely, but enough for something else to take its place. Something quieter. Something more human. Rowan watched it happen without interrupting. He had seen that moment before. The way a child decided whether to trust. The way a dog responded without force or expectation. It wasn't something that could be taught quickly. It either happened or it didn't. Behind them, Harper stepped back slightly, allowing space to open. "His name's Miles," she said, her voice softer now, less guarded. "He's my son." Rowan nodded again, taking that in. "Rowan," he said, gesturing briefly to himself, then toward the dog. "And that's Coda." Sienna shifted her weight, her arms crossing loosely as she leaned against the edge of the doorway. "You really didn't know anyone was here?" she asked. Rowan shook his head. "I thought this place was falling apart." "It was," Harper said. "When we found it, it barely stood. Roof leaking, floors warped, walls rotting from the inside out." She glanced back toward the interior of the house, her expression tightening slightly at the memory. "Most people wouldn't have stayed." "But you did," Rowan said. Harper met his gaze. "We didn't have another option." That was the first time the words had been said without defensiveness, just truth. Sienna looked down briefly, then back up. "We moved around a lot before this," she added. "Different places, different towns. Nothing ever lasted." Her voice carried a quiet weight, like each word had been lived through more than once. "When we found this place, it was the first time we could actually stop." Rowan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped onto the porch fully now, the wood creaking beneath his weight again. The sound seemed louder this time, more final. He crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was warmer, touched by the steady burn of a stove that had been kept going with care. The room wasn't large, but it was organized. Clean in a way that didn't come from comfort, but from effort. A table sat near the center, its surface worn but cleared. Shelves lined one wall, holding jars and supplies that had been gathered slowly, piece by piece. A blanket hung over the back of a chair, patched in several places but still in use. Nothing here was new, but everything here mattered. Rowan took it in without comment, his eyes moving slowly across the room, not searching for flaws, measuring the work. Miles followed Coda inside, his earlier caution replaced by a growing interest. He walked alongside the dog now, not quite touching, but close enough to feel connected to something steady. Harper closed the door behind them, the sound quiet but deliberate. "We didn't expect anyone to come back," she said. "Not after all this time." "I didn't expect to," Rowan replied. Sienna let out a small breath, something almost like a laugh, though it didn't fully form. "Then why now?" Rowan paused. Not because he didn't have an answer, because he did. "There's a deadline," he said finally. 30 days. If the taxes aren't paid, the land gets taken." The words settled into the room, heavy and immediate. Harper straightened slightly. "Taken by who?" "The county," Rowan said. "Or whoever buys it after." Sienna's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed that. "So even if we leave, it doesn't stay empty?" "No," Rowan said. "It doesn't." Silence followed again, but this time it wasn't uncertain. It was understanding. Miles looked up from where he stood beside Coda. "So we could lose it?" he asked, his voice smaller now, the weight of the situation finally reaching him. Harper knelt slightly beside him, her hand resting on his back. "We'll figure something out," she said, though the certainty in her voice wasn't as strong as before. Rowan watched them, the way she said it, the way the boy believed it, even if it wasn't guaranteed. He looked around the room once more, at the repairs, the care, the life that had been built here without permission, but not without meaning. Then he spoke. "We've got time," he said. "Not much, but enough to try." Sienna met his gaze. "Try what?" Rowan didn't answer right away. He glanced at Coda, then back at the room, then finally at the people standing in it. "Not leaving," he said. The words didn't sound like a decision.
They sounded like the start of something.
The rhythm of the house began to settle into something quieter after Rowan spoke, but it never returned to what it had been before he arrived. The air carried a new kind of awareness now, as if every movement, every sound, had gained weight. No one said it out loud, but the truth had already taken hold. 30 days wasn't a long time. It was barely enough to breathe, let alone rebuild something that could hold against what was coming. Morning light shifted slowly across the wooden floor as the fire in the stove burned low. Harper moved first, rising from her chair with the kind of quiet determination that came from habit rather than decision. She was already reaching for something to do, something practical, something that could keep her hands busy even when her thoughts refused to settle. Sienna followed not long after, her movements slower, more deliberate, her eyes occasionally drifting toward Rowan as if still measuring the presence he brought into their space. Rowan stood near the window, his posture still, his gaze fixed on the land outside. He had already begun mapping it in his mind, the fence lines, the open ground, the blind spots near the trees. Not because he expected a fight, but because he understood patterns, and something about this situation didn't feel finished. Coda remained near the center of the room, stretched out but alert, his ears lifting slightly at every shift in sound. Miles sat beside him on the floor, quietly running his fingers along the dog's fur, his earlier boldness replaced by something steadier now. He didn't speak much, but he didn't leave either. It was Sienna who noticed it first. A sound, low, distant, but familiar. Her head lifted slightly, her eyes narrowing as she turned toward the window. Harper stopped what she was doing almost immediately, her body reacting before her mind caught up. Rowan didn't ask. He had already heard it. An engine, not passing by, approaching. The sound grew louder, tires crunching slowly over gravel, deliberate, unhurried. Whoever it was, they weren't lost. They knew exactly where they were going. Miles looked up, his hand pausing against Coda's fur. "Someone's coming," he said, his voice quieter than before. Harper moved toward the door, not rushing, but not hesitating either. Sienna stepped beside her, her shoulders tightening just slightly. Rowan didn't move at first. He watched, listened. Then he followed, stopping just behind them, close enough to step in, far enough to let them stand where they had always stood. The truck came into view slowly, an older model, dark paint dulled by time but still intact. It rolled to a stop just beyond the gate, engine idling for a moment before cutting off. Silence followed, thick and immediate. The door opened. The man who stepped out carried himself like someone who didn't need to hurry. He was in his mid-40s, tall but not imposing in a physical sense, his strength resting more in the way he held his ground than in his build. His hair was short, thinning slightly at the temples, and his face bore the kind of lines that came from years of negotiation rather than labor. He wore a dark jacket over a collared shirt, clean, structured, out of place against the rough edges of the land around him. This was Derek Halston. He closed the truck door gently, his movements controlled, almost casual, as if this visit was routine. His eyes moved across the property once, taking everything in, the fence, the house, the repairs, before settling on the people standing on the porch. A smile formed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well," he said, his voice smooth, measured, carrying just enough warmth to sound polite without being sincere. "Looks like you're all still here." Harper didn't step back. "We told you before," she said, her tone firm, steadier than it had been the day before. "We're not leaving." Derek's gaze shifted slightly, not dismissing her, but not fully engaging either. "I admire the persistence," he replied. "I really do. But persistence doesn't change the outcome." Sienna crossed her arms loosely, her posture controlled but tense. "You've said that before." "And I was right then," Derek said. "I'm still right now." Rowan stepped forward then, not fast, not aggressive, just enough to change the shape of the moment. Derek noticed immediately. His eyes flicked toward Rowan, a brief pause breaking his rhythm before it returned. "And you are?" he asked, the question polite but sharpened by curiosity. Rowan didn't answer right away. He reached into his jacket again, pulling out the same folded documents, holding them at his side this time rather than raising them immediately. "Owner," he said. The word landed differently this time. Derek's smile didn't disappear, but it thinned, just slightly, enough to show that something had shifted beneath it. He took a step closer, his gaze settling more fully on Rowan now, studying him in a way that went beyond simple acknowledgement. "I wasn't aware the property still had one," Derek said. "It does," Rowan replied. Silence followed, short but heavy. Derek nodded once, slow, as if adjusting a calculation in his head. "That complicates things," he admitted, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly concerned. But not by much. Harper glanced briefly at Rowan, then back at Derek. "We're not selling," she said. Derek's attention returned to her, the faintest hint of amusement touching his expression. "You're not in a position to sell," he corrected. "You're in a position to leave." Sienna's jaw tightened. "Not happening." Derek let out a small breath, something close to patience wearing thin. "This land is already in motion," he said. "Taxes unpaid, deadlines approaching. Whether you stay or go, the result is the same. The county takes it. Then it gets auctioned." His gaze shifted back to Rowan. "Unless, of course, someone steps in before that." Rowan didn't react. He already knew what was being implied. "You?" Rowan asked. Derek smiled again, this time a little more openly. "I represent interests that see potential here," he said. "Development, expansion. Something more useful than letting it sit like this." Miles stepped closer to Harper, his hand gripping the fabric of her sleeve. "We don't want that," he said, his voice small but clear. Derek looked down at him briefly, his expression unreadable. "That's not really how it works," he said. Coda rose then, slowly, deliberately. He stepped forward just enough to place himself between Miles and the edge of the porch, his body angled slightly, his gaze fixed on Derek. He didn't bark, didn't growl loudly, just a low, controlled sound, barely above silence, enough to be felt more than heard. Derek paused, only for a second, but it was there. He glanced at the dog, then back at Rowan. "Well trained," he said. Rowan didn't respond. Derek straightened slightly, brushing a hand over his jacket as if resetting the moment. "I'll give you time," he said. "Not out of generosity, just practicality. 30 days isn't long." His eyes moved between all of them, lingering for a fraction longer on Rowan. "Use it however you want." He turned then, walking back toward his truck without rushing, without looking back immediately. Just before reaching the door, he paused, his voice carrying over his shoulder. "But don't mistake time for control," he added. "You don't have that." The truck door closed, the engine started, and just like that, he was gone. The sound of gravel faded slowly into the distance, leaving the silence behind once more. No one spoke right away. Miles looked up at Rowan. "Is he coming back?" he asked. Rowan's eyes remained on the road long after the truck had disappeared. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He is." Harper exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly. Sienna didn't move, her gaze still fixed ahead, her thoughts clearly turning over something deeper now. Because this wasn't just about staying anymore, it was about holding on. And Rowan knew one thing for certain: men like Derek Halston didn't let go. The dust from Derek Halston's truck had long settled, but the weight he left behind didn't fade with it. It lingered in the air, in the quiet spaces between words, in the way no one moved quite as freely as they had before. The house still stood, the land still held, but something had shifted, and all of them felt it, even if none of them spoke it out loud. That evening came slower than usual. The sky dimmed into a muted gray, clouds stretching thin across the horizon as the temperature dipped again. Inside the farmhouse, the stove burned steadily, its warmth pushing back the cold just enough to make the space livable. Harper moved around the kitchen with quiet focus, preparing what little they had for dinner, her motions efficient, practiced. Sienna worked beside her, handling small tasks without needing direction, though her mind clearly wandered elsewhere. Every now and then, her gaze drifted toward the window, as if expecting something to return. Rowan stayed near the edge of the room, leaning lightly against the wall, arms crossed, observing without interfering. He wasn't used to this kind of stillness, not this kind. In the past, quiet had meant absence. Now, it meant something forming, something uncertain. Koda lay near the doorway, his body relaxed but his awareness unchanged. His ears twitched at the smallest sound, his attention shifting between the people in the room and the space outside. He had already accepted this place as part of his environment, but not as something safe, not yet. Miles sat on the floor again, this time with a small piece of wood in his hands, carving carefully with a dull knife that had clearly seen better days. His tongue pressed lightly against the corner of his mouth in concentration, his earlier bravado replaced by quiet focus. Every so often, he glanced toward Rowan, not directly, but enough to show that he was paying attention. It was Harper who finally broke the silence. "He's not going to stop," she said, her voice steady but low. No one needed to ask who she meant. Rowan nodded once. "No," he said. Sienna set something down a little harder than necessary, the sound sharp against the stillness. "Then what do we do?" she asked, turning toward him. "Because waiting doesn't seem like a plan." Rowan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pushed off the wall and stepped closer to the table, his eyes moving across the room as if assembling something piece by piece. "We make it harder," he said finally. Harper glanced at him. "Harder how?" "By not leaving gaps," Rowan replied. "Not in the land, not in the paperwork, not in how you move." He looked toward the window briefly, then back at them. "People like him don't push where they expect resistance. They push where things look weak." Sienna folded her arms, considering that. "And you think we look weak?" Rowan met her gaze, not challenging, just direct. "I think you've been holding this place together with what you had," he said. "That's not weakness, but it's not enough to stop someone who knows how to take advantage of it." The words landed, not harsh, but honest. Harper exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly. "We did what we could," she said. "I know," Rowan replied. Miles looked up from the floor, his brow furrowing slightly. "So we fix it more?" he asked. Rowan glanced down at him, then nodded once. "Yeah," he said. "We fix what we can, and we don't make it easy for anyone to take it." That seemed to settle something, at least for the boy. Miles nodded back, returning his focus to the piece of wood in his hands with renewed purpose. The door opened quietly then, a soft creak followed by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. All eyes turned toward the entryway as a new figure stepped inside. She moved carefully, as if each step required thought, not because she was weak, but because she had learned not to waste energy. The woman appeared to be in her late 60s, her hair silver and pulled back loosely at the nape of her neck. Her face carried deep lines, not just from age, but from years of work and endurance. Her frame was slight, but there was a steadiness to her posture that suggested resilience rather than fragility. She wore a long, worn coat and carried a small basket filled with greens, freshly picked despite the cold. This was Martha Quinn. She paused just inside the doorway, her eyes settling on Rowan with quiet curiosity rather than alarm. Unlike the others, she didn't react with tension. She simply observed, taking in his presence, his stance, the way he held himself. "Well," she said gently, her voice calm, textured with time but not weakened by it. "Looks like we've got company." Harper stepped forward slightly. "Martha, this is Rowan," she said. "It's his land." Martha nodded once, as if that confirmed something she had already suspected. She set the basket down on the table without rushing, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "That explains a few things," she said. Rowan straightened slightly, acknowledging her presence. "You live here too?" "For the past 6 months," Martha replied. "After my brother passed, I lost my place. They gave me a bed." She gestured lightly toward Harper and Sienna. Didn't ask for anything in return. Sienna looked down briefly, uncomfortable with the attention, but didn't deny it. Rowan took that in, another piece of the picture. This wasn't just a place being occupied, it was being shared. Martha studied him for a moment longer, her eyes thoughtful. "You don't look like a man who came back for nothing," she said. Rowan didn't respond to that directly. Instead, he glanced toward the table, then back at her. "Didn't expect to find this," he admitted. "Most people don't," Martha said. "That's why they leave." The room settled again, but this time it felt different. Less like something waiting to break, more like something trying to understand itself. Dinner came together without further discussion. Simple food, nothing wasted. They sat around the table, the arrangement awkward at first, then slowly finding a rhythm. Miles spoke more than anyone, filling the quiet with small stories, details of things that seemed insignificant but carried meaning to him. Harper listened while keeping an eye on everything at once. Sienna spoke less, but when she did, her voice carried more certainty than before. Rowan listened, not because he had nothing to say, but because, for the first time in a long time, he didn't need to fill the silence. Coda remained beneath the table, still but aware, his presence grounding in a way that required no attention. At one point, Martha looked at Rowan again, her expression thoughtful. "You planning to stay?" she asked. The question wasn't casual, it was direct. Rowan paused, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the table. He looked around the room, at the people sitting there, at the space that had been rebuilt without him. Then he answered. "For now," he said. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't nothing either. Outside, the wind moved quietly across the land, brushing against the fence lines, carrying the faint scent of earth and wood smoke into the night. The farmhouse stood where it always had, but it no longer felt like something abandoned. It felt like something being held together. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. For now. The change didn't come all at once. It settled in quietly, like the cold that crept back in after sunset, unnoticed at first, until it was everywhere. The farmhouse still stood the same, the land unchanged to the eye, but the way they moved through it had shifted. What had once been routine was now deliberate. Every step, every task, carried intention. Rowan was up before the others. The sky was still dark, a pale line just beginning to form along the horizon. The air bit sharper this morning, the kind that settled deep in the lungs and stayed there. He stood outside near the fence line, his breath steady, his eyes scanning the property in slow, measured passes. The repairs he had noted before were still holding, but now he saw them differently, not as effort, but as vulnerabilities. Coda moved beside him, silent as ever, his paws pressing lightly into the damp ground. His ears flicked once, then again, catching something distant. Rowan didn't look at him. He didn't need to. He trusted the signal. They walked the perimeter together. Rowan paused near the back corner of the fence, crouching slightly as his hand brushed against one of the wooden posts. The soil around it was disturbed. Not from weather, not from time, from movement, recent. He straightened slowly, his jaw tightening just enough to register the shift. No alarm, no reaction, just confirmation. Someone had been here. When he returned to the house, the others were beginning to wake. Harper stood near the stove, already working, her movements quiet but efficient. Sienna sat at the table, a notebook open in front of her, pencil in hand, numbers scattered across the page in uneven columns. Miles hovered nearby, still half asleep but trying to appear otherwise. Martha sat by the window, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the land outside as if she had been watching it long before Rowan came in. Rowan closed the door behind him without a sound. Harper glanced up. "You've been out there a while." Rowan nodded once. "Fence line's been touched," he said. "Back corner." The room stilled. Sienna's pencil stopped moving. "Animals?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Rowan shook his head. "No." Miles looked up, his expression tightening. "Him?" Rowan didn't answer directly. "Doesn't matter who," he said. "It matters that it happened." Harper exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly before settling again. "So what do we do?" Rowan stepped further into the room, his gaze moving from one person to the next. "We stop reacting," he said. "We start controlling." Sienna leaned back slightly in her chair, studying him. "That sounds good," she said. "Doesn't explain how." Rowan reached for the edge of the table, his fingers resting lightly against the worn wood. "We tighten everything," he said. "Fence, locks, water line, no weak spots, no easy access. If someone wants in, they work for it." Harper nodded slowly.
We can reinforce the east side, she said. That's where it's weakest. I'll take the back, Rowan replied. Miles stepped forward a little. What about me? He asked. Rowan glanced at him, not dismissive, measuring. You watch, he said. You learn, and you don't go anywhere alone. Miles nodded, accepting that without argument. The day moved quickly after that. There was no discussion about whether they would act. They simply did. Rowan worked along the back fence first, replacing sections of wood that had been patched too loosely, driving nails deeper, adjusting angles so they held under pressure. His movements were efficient, precise, every action serving a purpose. Harper worked the east side, her strength showing in the way she handled the heavier sections, her focus unbroken even as the cold settled into her hands. Sienna stayed near the center of the property at first, her attention split between helping where needed and returning to the notebook she carried.
She had begun organizing something more structured now, numbers turning into plans, small calculations forming the beginnings of something that might hold against the 30 days ahead. Martha worked closer to the house, tending to the smaller but no less important tasks. She checked supplies, organized what little they had, her movement slower but steady. She didn't try to match their pace. She didn't need to. What she did held the same weight. Coda moved between them all. He didn't stay in one place for long, his path shifting naturally from one side of the property to the other, his presence quiet but constant. He paused when something caught his attention, his body stilling completely before moving on again. Nothing went unnoticed. Miles followed him at a distance, at first uncertain, then more confident, his steps growing steadier as the hours passed. He carried a pair of old binoculars Rowan had handed him earlier, holding them with more seriousness than the object deserved. Every so often, he would stop, raise them to his eyes, and scan the horizon the way he had seen Rowan do. Most of the time, he saw nothing, but that wasn't the point. By midday, the work had begun to show. The fence stood tighter, the gaps smaller. The property, once open in ways that made it vulnerable, now carried a different presence. Not closed, but aware. Rowan stepped back from the last section he had worked on, his hands brushing against his jeans as he took in the result. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was enough. For now. Sienna approached him then, her notebook still in hand. I've been looking at the numbers, she said. If we push what we can sell, eggs, produce, anything we can make, we might cover part of it. Not all, but something. Rowan nodded. It's a start. She hesitated for a moment, then added, You really think he'll keep pushing? Rowan didn't look at her immediately. His gaze remained on the land, on the lines they had just reinforced. He already is, he said. The answer settled between them. Not heavy, just clear. A sharp sound cut through the air then, wood cracking. All movement stopped. Rowan turned instantly, his body already shifting toward the source before his mind fully processed it. Coda reacted faster, his head snapping toward the far edge of the property, his posture tightening in a way that hadn't shown all day. Miles lowered the binoculars, his eyes wide. There, he said, pointing. The back corner. The same place Rowan had checked that morning. Rowan moved without hesitation, his pace controlled but fast enough to close the distance quickly. Harper followed, Sienna just behind her. The ground gave slightly under their steps, the damp soil shifting as they approached. When they reached the fence, the problem was clear. One of the posts had been forced loose. Not enough to collapse, just enough to weaken. Rowan crouched beside it, his hand pressing against the wood, testing the give. His jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained controlled, deliberate, not random. Harper looked out beyond the fence line, her eyes scanning the empty stretch of land. He was here, she said. Rowan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Coda stepped forward to the edge, his body still, his gaze fixed on something beyond what the others could see. A low sound built in his chest, quiet but certain. Rowan stood slowly. He wants us to know, he said. Sienna's arms folded tighter across her chest. Why not just come back himself? Rowan glanced at the damaged post, then back toward the open land beyond it. Because this works better, he said. It makes us second-guess everything. Miles stepped closer, his voice quieter now. So what do we do? Rowan looked down at him, then back at the fence. Then he reached for the tools he had brought. We fix it, he said. No hesitation, no change in tone, just the same answer as before. And this time, it meant more. The number didn't change. It sat there, quiet and immovable, shaping everything without needing to be said again. 30 days. Not a warning anymore. Not something waiting in the distance, but something already unfolding. Every hour that passed belonged to it. Every decision bent toward it. And for the first time since Rowan had returned, the land no longer felt like something uncertain. It felt like something they were trying to hold together against time itself. Morning came colder than the day before. A thin frost clung to the ground, settling over the rows Harper had turned, coating the fence lines in a faint silver that caught the early light. The sky was clear, pale blue stretching over the mountains, offering no shelter from the chill. The air was sharp enough to wake the body fully with every breath. Rowan stood near the front of the property, his hands resting loosely at his sides as he watched the road. He had taken to that position without thinking, the habit forming quickly. Not guarding, not expecting, just aware. Coda sat beside him, posture straight, his attention fixed in the same direction. The dog had adapted to the rhythm faster than anyone else. He moved when needed, rested when allowed, and never missed a shift in the environment. If Rowan noticed something, Coda had already seen it. Behind them, the rest of the morning was already in motion. Harper worked the soil despite the frost, her breath visible in the air as she moved through the rows, checking what had survived the cold, adjusting what she could. She had tied her hair back tighter than usual, her sleeves rolled despite the temperature, her movements carrying a quiet urgency now. This wasn't just maintenance anymore, it was survival with a deadline. Sienna stood near a small table they had moved outside, her notebook open, pages filled with numbers that had grown more organized over the past few days. She had begun grouping things now. What they had, what they could make, what they might sell. Her handwriting, once scattered, had steadied into something more precise. She wasn't guessing anymore. She was building something that might actually work. Miles moved between them, his energy focused but uneven, like he was still learning how to direct it. He carried a small basket, collecting eggs from the coop, checking each one carefully before placing it inside. His earlier excitement had shifted into something quieter, something more determined. He wasn't playing anymore. He understood enough now to know this mattered. Martha remained close to the house, her role as steady as ever. She worked at a small wooden counter near the doorway, shaping dough with practiced hands, her movements slow but sure. The scent of bread carried faintly through the air, subtle but grounding. She didn't rush. She never did. But everything she made had purpose. Rowan watched all of it, not as an outsider anymore, as part of it. After a moment, he turned and walked back toward the center of the property. "We need to move faster," he said, not loudly, but enough for all of them to hear. Harper didn't look up. "We're already moving." "I know," Rowan replied, "but we need more than this." Sienna closed her notebook halfway, her eyes lifting. "More what?" "Output," Rowan said. "More than just enough for us. Enough to trade, enough to sell, enough to matter." Harper straightened slightly, wiping her hands against her jeans. "We're limited," she said. "Tools, time, weather. None of that changes just because we need it to." Rowan nodded once. "Then we change how we use it." The words hung there for a second, not fully clear, but not empty either. Sienna stepped closer. "You have something in mind?" she said. Rowan glanced toward the barn, then back at them. "There's wood we haven't used," he said. "Scrap, old boards, parts from the sections that couldn't be fixed. We turned it into something else." Miles looked up immediately. "Like what?" "Anything people can use," Rowan said. "Crates, shelves, small furniture. Doesn't have to be perfect. It has to hold." Harper considered that, her expression tightening as she ran through the idea. "We don't have proper tools for that," she said. "I've worked with less," Rowan replied. Sienna opened her notebook again, flipping to a blank page. "If we can make enough of it," she said slowly, "and combine that with what we already have, we might be able to push the numbers higher." "Not enough to cover everything," Harper added. "No," Sienna agreed, "but closer."
Rowan didn't respond to that. Closer was enough. The rest of the morning shifted after that. The barn, once used only for storage, became something else. Rowan cleared space first, moving what wasn't needed, organizing what could be used. His movements were efficient, each action feeding into the next without hesitation. He worked the wood carefully, cutting, shaping, assembling with a precision that didn't come from craftsmanship alone, but from years of making things work under pressure. Harper joined him not long after, her strength making up for what they lacked in equipment. She handled the heavier pieces, stabilizing, adjusting, reinforcing where needed. They didn't speak much while they worked. They didn't need to. Sienna remained outside at first, coordinating what they already had, organizing items into groups, preparing them for trade or sale. But by midday, she moved into the barn as well, taking on the smaller tasks, sanding edges, checking stability, making sure nothing left unfinished. Miles watched for a while. Then he joined in. Not with the tools, not at first, but with the smaller pieces, handing things over, holding parts steady when asked, his attention focused in a way it hadn't been before. He didn't complain, didn't lose interest. He stayed.
Coda moved between them all, his presence unchanged, but his position always shifting to where he was needed most. He paused at the barn entrance often, his gaze turning outward, watching the land beyond while the others worked inside. By late afternoon, the first pieces were done. Simple, rough, but solid. Rowan set one down near the entrance, stepping back just enough to take it in. It wasn't about how it looked. It was about whether it would hold. It did. Sienna approached, her eyes scanning the work, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface. "People will buy this," she said. Harper leaned against one of the beams, her breathing heavier now, but steady. "Then we make more." Rowan nodded once. They didn't celebrate, they didn't pause, because the number hadn't changed. 30 days, still counting. As the light began to fade, the work slowed, not by choice, but by necessity. The temperature dropped again, the cold settling in quickly as the sun dipped behind the mountains. They gathered what they had made, moving it carefully toward the house, stacking it near the wall. Miles stood nearby, his arms crossed in a way that mimicked Rowan without realizing it. "We're going to keep it," he said. It wasn't a question. Rowan looked at him, then at the work they had done, then at the land beyond. "We're going to try," he said. Miles nodded, satisfied with that. Inside, the warmth returned slowly as the fire built up again. Martha set the bread on the table, its scent stronger now, filling the room with something that felt almost like comfort. They sat together again, quieter than before, but not uncertain, just focused. Sienna looked at her notebook one last time before closing it. "We're not there yet," she said. "No," Rowan replied. Harper leaned back slightly, her eyes closing for just a moment before opening again. "But we're not where we were either." That was enough, for now. Because the land hadn't changed, the threat hadn't changed, but they had. And that was the difference that mattered. The last morning didn't arrive with anything dramatic. No storm, no sudden change. Just a quiet kind of light spreading slowly across the land, touching the frost that still lingered in the shaded corners of the field. The sky stretched clear above Montana, pale and open, the mountains holding steady in the distance like they always had. If someone had driven past without knowing, they would have seen nothing unusual, just a farmhouse, a fence, a piece of land that had learned how to endure. But inside, everything had already shifted. Rowan stood outside before the others woke, as he had every day since he returned. His boots pressed into the same ground that had once felt distant to him, unfamiliar in a way he hadn't expected. Now it didn't. Now it felt anchored, not because it had changed, but because he had stopped trying to walk away from it. Coda stood beside him, his posture calm, his gaze fixed forward. He didn't need to move. He didn't need to react. The stillness itself said enough. The land was quiet, not empty, just quiet in a way that didn't carry tension anymore. Rowan exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. Today was the last day, not of the land, of the deadline. Behind him, the door opened softly. Harper stepped out first, her jacket pulled tight against the cold, her hair tied back in the same practical way it always was. There was less strain in her face now, though it hadn't disappeared entirely. It had settled into something steadier, something that didn't shift with every uncertain moment. "You've been up a while," she said. Rowan didn't turn immediately. "Couldn't sleep," he replied. Harper stepped beside him, her eyes moving across the property, the fence, the barn, the rows they had worked together. "Feels different," she said. Rowan nodded once. "It is." Sienna joined them a moment later, her notebook in hand out of habit, though she didn't open it this time. She stood just behind them at first, then stepped forward, her posture more relaxed than it had been when Rowan first arrived. The guarded distance she once carried had softened into something else. Not trust all at once, but something built over time. "It's today," she said quietly. Rowan finally turned slightly, just enough to look at her. "Yeah." Miles came next, pushing the door open with less care than the others, his energy returning in small bursts now that the waiting was almost over. He stopped when he reached them, his eyes scanning the land the way Rowan had taught him, even if he didn't fully understand why. Coda moved toward him, brushing lightly against his side before settling again. "We did it," Miles said. No one corrected him, because no one wanted to take that away. Martha stepped out last, her slower pace unchanged, her presence as steady as it had been from the beginning. She didn't say anything at first. She simply stood with them, her gaze taking in the same view, the same land, but with a different kind of understanding. They didn't have to wait long. The sound came again, low and familiar, the same way it had before. An engine moving along the gravel road, approaching without hesitation. This time, no one reacted with surprise. They were ready. The truck came into view, stopping near the gate just as it had days before. Derek Halston stepped out, his movements unchanged, his posture carrying the same controlled confidence. But his eyes moved differently now, taking in the fence, the repairs, the signs of effort that had multiplied since his last visit. He closed the door behind him and approached slowly, his hands resting casually at his sides. "Well," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something sharper than before. "Looks like you've been busy." Harper didn't step back. "We have." Derek's gaze shifted briefly toward the stacked goods near the barn, then back to Rowan. "It won't be enough," he said. "It never is." Rowan didn't respond immediately. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded set of papers, different from the ones he had shown before. He held them out, not as a challenge, but as a statement. "It is," he said. Derek's expression didn't change at first. He took the papers, unfolding them with careful precision, his eyes scanning the contents. The silence stretched, not uncertain, but deliberate. The payment had been made, not all at once, not easily, but enough. Enough to stop the process, enough to hold the land. Derek exhaled slowly, the first real break in his composure since he had arrived. It wasn't anger, it was adjustment. Calculation shifting into something else. "Impressive," he said, though the word carried no warmth. "Didn't expect that." Rowan held his gaze. "We did." Derek folded the papers again, handing them back without resistance. His eyes moved across the group, lingering briefly on each of them. Harper, Sienna, Miles, Martha, then Coda, then back to Rowan. "This isn't over," he said. "Land like this doesn't stay quiet forever." Rowan nodded once. "We're not asking it to." Derek studied him for a moment longer, as if weighing something he hadn't considered before. Then he stepped back, his posture loosening just slightly. "Well," he said, "for now, it's yours." He turned without another word, walking back toward his truck. This time, he didn't pause. He didn't look back. The engine started, the gravel shifted beneath the tires, and then he was gone. The silence that followed felt different. Not empty, not uncertain. Finished. Miles let out a breath he had been holding, his shoulders dropping as he looked up at the others. "We won," he said again, softer this time. Harper knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "We held on," she corrected gently. Sienna closed her notebook, not with hesitation but with finality. She didn't need it anymore, not in the same way. The numbers had done what they needed to do. Martha smiled faintly, her eyes glistening just enough to catch the light. She didn't speak, but her expression said more than words could. Rowan remained where he stood, his gaze fixed on the road long after the truck had disappeared. For a long time, he had believed this place was something he had lost, something tied to the past, to memory, to things he couldn't change. He had been wrong. It wasn't something left behind. It was something waiting. He looked back at the house, at the land, at the people who stood there with him. And for the first time in years, the weight he carried didn't feel like something he had to outrun. It felt like something he could set down. Coda moved closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Rowan's leg. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. Rowan rested a hand briefly against the dog's back, then let it fall. Harper stood again, her posture easing in a way that hadn't been possible before. Sienna stepped closer, not saying anything, but not holding distance either. Miles ran ahead toward the field, his laughter breaking through the quiet in a way that didn't feel fragile anymore. Martha turned toward the house, already thinking ahead, already moving toward what came next. Rowan stayed where he was for one more moment. Then he followed. Because this place wasn't something he had returned to. It was something he had chosen to stay for. And this time, he didn't leave. Sometimes the miracle is not loud or sudden. It does not arrive with signs in the sky or answers that solve everything at once. Sometimes the miracle is quiet. It is the moment when broken people choose to stay instead of walk away. It is the strength to rebuild when nothing is promised. It is the kindness that appears when fear could have taken over. In this story, what saved them was not just effort, it was grace. The kind of grace that God places in our lives through other people, through second chances, through doors we thought were closed but were only waiting for us to return. In our daily lives, we may not see it clearly, but God is always working in the background, guiding us, protecting us, and placing the right people at the right time. Sometimes, all we need to do is take one step forward with faith. If this story touched your heart, share where you are watching from and the moment someone showed up for you when you needed it most. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel to support more stories like this. And if you believe in quiet miracles, type Amen in the comments. May God bless you, protect you, and bring peace to your home.